He conceives of the celestial bodies, stars, planets as ecologies of divine beings. Only at the end of an occult path does the study of astrology come into consideration. He thought it could be dangerous because it can reinforce the egoistic form of self-interest that is only limited to this particular lifetime. It's when we believe that, this is the only life I have and I only want good things for myself and I want to avoid all the bad things. But he says, actually, some of the supposedly bad things might have really important significance. Ahriman is this dark force that must incarnate. It's like the necessity of, I guess you could say, the death process. Every phase of cosmic evolution includes this sort of upbuilding process where something is being born and coming into being, and then a phase of the process where it starts to decay and fall apart and die. Everything comes from and then returns to God.
Hello friends, in this interview episode of World Astrology Report, I'm joined by astrologer Ashton Arnoldy to talk about the Austrian mystic Rudolf Steiner and his relationship with astrology. Steiner was a remarkable man whose prophetic descriptions of 21st century life from more than a century ago have led a lot of people today to conclude that he had a genuine clairvoyant gift and a deep understanding of the spiritual dimensions of life. At the time of recording, Ashton was staying at the Goetheanum, the headquarters of the Anthroposophical movement in Dornach, Switzerland, where he's been researching Steiner's relationship with astrology. So that's what we talk about mostly in this video, as well as the meaning of spiritual science and Steiner's ideas about the Incarnation of Ahriman, the adversarial being said to be the embodiment of materialism. Please do like this video and show your support for the channel and subscribe if you don't want to miss future episodes. As usual, there's also an extended members-only version of the video, this time with an extra 30 minutes of material in which we talk about Steiner's wider model of human history and consciousness evolution and how it fits with astrological frameworks like the yugas and the astrological ages. It's available for members here on YouTube or at worldastrologyreport.com. Oh, and just a quick reminder that we're doing our next monthly World Astrology Report long-form members live stream at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, November the 28th. It's going to be my 2026 forecast, and it's called 2026, the year that remakes reality. You won't want to miss it. You can purchase entry to the stream on the live streams page of my website. The entry is free for website members and for YouTube members at correspondent tier. All right, without further ado, let's get into the interview. Hello, friends. I'm here with Ashton Arnoldy, who is coming to us from Dornach, Switzerland, the Goetheanum of Rudolf Steiner. Thanks for joining us on World Astrology Report, Ashton.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Yeah, no, it's great to finally talk. We've been discussing this for a little while, and we are going to talk about Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian mystic and founder of Anthroposophy. And I thought it would be good to start by just introducing Steiner. Who was Steiner, and why are his ideas still interesting for people today?
Yeah, well, Rudolf Steiner was born in 1861 and died in 1925. And as you mentioned, he was a spiritual teacher. He's most well known for being a spiritual teacher. I'd say a spiritual philosopher. And he began to teach, I guess, as a public esotericist around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century when he joined the Theosophical Society in Germany. But he always maintained a distinct teaching from the general orientation of the Theosophical Society. He really wanted to emphasize certain aspects of Western tradition. And also, he just insisted that he taught out of his own spiritual research. And for him, that research was, you could say, modeled after the participatory science of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who Goethe is most famous for being a poet, for writing Faust, and also for developing color theory. Participatory science merely means that one includes one's whole person as the instrument of knowing in this scientific enterprise. And what's exciting about Steiner's Anthroposophy is that he aims to extend Goethe's method through this process of self-transformation of the human being into a kind of instrument for spiritual knowledge. And so when I was first getting into Steiner, I was really excited about it because as a young person navigating what we many refer to today as the meaning crisis, where there's not one coherent cosmology in our globalized situation that can lead our lives, and with so many transformations of the traditional order, thanks to emancipatory politics, but also technology. Um, we can't just bring the old back. There has to be some sort of new negotiation of the world. But how? And I think that's one of the exciting things about Steiner's work is that he provides some possibilities for that.
Yeah, this is also, I think, one of the things that drew me to Steiner, and having studied some of the big planetary cycles that govern the evolution of consciousness over time, I've seen how, and this is obviously, you don't just need astrology to see this, but I've seen how we moved into a period of several hundred years where we embraced scientific materialism. And it was almost as if this was, you could argue, a sort of necessary stage or phase where we had to exclude the spiritual from the world so that we could gain some greater understanding of the mechanics of this material world that we live in. But that period has now passed. If we get to the time Steiner lived and was cutting his teeth, this was the late 19th century, which is a time that planetary cycles like the Pluto-Neptune cycle, for example, tell us that the new cycle was beginning at that time. And I think that new cycle has to do with bringing spirit back into our understanding of the cosmos. And what I understand from Steiner is that his methods may be a way into doing that, right? Because he taught what he called spiritual science, and perhaps that is something that can be very useful to us at this point in history.
Yes, yes. He was very insistent that even though we might have spiritual ideas and spiritual beliefs and spiritual practices, because of our conditioning, um, we're pretty much all materialists, even if we're not aware of it. And so, yes, exactly.
And in what sense could you say what Steiner taught was science, right? Because he called his way of working spiritual science, and probably a professional scientist who's not open to these kind of things would raise eyebrows at what Steiner taught being described as science. But for Steiner, why were his methods of spiritual perception spiritual science?
Yeah. So there's a lot of, you could say, resonance between what Steiner is calling spiritual science and anthroposophy interchangeably, and the pre-modern approach to knowledge before this distinction between knowing and life. It's comparable to reading the world. So this, prior to the scientific revolution, or I guess leading up to it, there wasn't this distinction that we make today, between astronomy and astrology. They were bound up together, and they were really co-arose together out of this need to have a kind of relationship and with the gods, as these intelligences that are speaking through the natural world and the events of life.
Let's take a little turn now, because we also wanted to talk a bit about Steiner and astrology specifically. Now, I know you're doing research on this subject and trying to shed more light on Steiner's own personal attitudes to and use of astrology. Could you maybe sketch out what Steiner's relationship with astrology was, what he thought about it, how he used it, and so on?
Yeah, so his overall orientation to astrology is informed by this whole vision of the evolution of consciousness. And it was actually one of the reasons that I was so interested in Steiner initially, kind of arriving at his work through Barfield, because it the narrative of the evolution of consciousness helped me as somebody who was, got into astrology when I was in high school and just like, had those experiences where I'm like, there's something here. There's something real that I'm like discovering through this about the world, and how something like this could be self-evident for human beings in the past, but has come to seem, as Rick Tarnas always says, to be the gold standard of superstition for moderns. That they provide this narrative for understanding how that could have come about. And so for Steiner, like astrology actually emerges in the course of this gradual fall, as a kind of craft that reflects an increasing attention to the natural world, and a recognition of regularities in the sky that one can track. And so it's like part of this whole process of self consciousness. Um, Coming online, there's this phrase we mentioned last time we met to talk about this a little bit. Not phrase, but this verse that Steiner uses, which I or came up with, which really characterizes his whole, at least in this sort of shorter Earth period of the evolution of consciousness. He says, "The stars once spoke to human beings." I don't have it up here right now, but basically, they've gone quiet, and in the darkness, the silence, there is uh, what human beings eventually will speak to the stars that will like reforge this connection. And so, one could say that astrology kind of facilitated the emergence of self consciousness to the extent that it provided this symbolic representation of the natural world that could allow individuals to get a bit of remove for it so as to have more agency and negotiate destiny. And so that, facilitates the self-interest, awakening. And, initially it was just used for the king and the state, but, gradually natal charts emerge. And his general orientation, as I've discovered about astrology, which you kind of experience when you get to know the world of anthroposophy and talk to people in it, is that he thought it could be dangerous because he believed, that we are in this process of reincarnation that is directed towards this uh, effort, a kind of education or re-education of humanity. Um, in wake of the fall, a kind of overcoming of our karmic debt of actions that have been undertaken in ignorance of our divine essence and our, fundamental unity with each other. And that so the process of reincarnation is all about sort of like redemption for Steiner. And so he says that we have a kind of pre-birth will that orders the events of the coming life such that we will have experiences that will be part of this education of our soul and this process of redemption. And astrology for him is dangerous because it can reinforce the egoistic form of self-interest that is only limited to this particular lifetime. It's when we believe that, this is the only life I have and I only want good things for myself and I want to avoid all the bad things. But he says, actually, some of the like supposedly bad things might have, really important significance according to like our deeper, more unconscious, will of our spirit, like that higher, deeper aspect of ourselves. So that was like one of the reasons why he was cautious about it. And one thing, just also to mention, in connection with this, is that he said only at the end of an occult path does the study of astrology come into consideration. Only then does it become necessary, which is really interesting. And I'll circle back to it eventually. But when you get into anthroposophy, and this is one of the things that excited me about it, the lore and terminology of astrology is like all over it. Like, I mentioned these former names of the cosmic epochs, Saturn, Sun, Moon. They all have I think he chose them for archetypal reasons, and even says that they have these distant cosmic epochs have a kind of correspondence with the arrangement of the solar system now. So it's a really marvelous vision, and he puts astrology to use in all kinds of different ways, and even uses tropical and sidereal astrology with different applications. So, like, biodynamic agriculture is very much based on the uneven distribution of the zodiac according to a certain, form of sidereal astrology. So farmers, really focus with their almanacs on celestial influences, and that's also a factor in anthroposophic medicine and the creation of homeopathic remedies. It's also sort of like at work implicitly in Waldorf education in the way they structure the unfolding of the pedagogy, like according to these teachings he had about 7-year cycles, which I don't know if he explicitly links to Saturn, but we can just assume. There's always a kind of like sacred numerology or mathematics going on in anthroposophy. You could say there's astrology at work there, and they make a big deal about the nodal return and the Saturn return. Um, he also used tropical astrology, so he did an election for the laying of the foundation stone, which was an important moment in the whole world of anthroposophy. And he has this book of verses called the Calendar of the Soul, which essentially is like a way of attuning us to the spiritual process of the light cycle, but he ties them to the tropical zodiac. So it's really interesting. He uses both in different for different contexts. I don't know if he like made any explicit statements about it. Um, and then, one more thing that I think is really interesting and unique about Steiner is that he reconciles the sort of archetypal picture of the solar system that we get in astrology, but, has been passed down to us from a time when there was not the notion of evolution had not arisen yet. And so there was more of this sort of eternal conception of the cosmos as eternal. And what Steiner does is he like integrates evolutionary theory and like this archetypal picture of the cosmos in a way that seems pretty coherent. And I mentioned I was in this philosophy program, which philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness, which Richard Tarnas started. And there's another professor in that program, Brian Swim, who is an evolutionary cosmologist. And they were bringing kind of different perspectives. And students would always be like, okay, well, how do these fit together? Like, do the archetypes like evolve into being? Like, what does it mean that there's all these other planets and galaxies? And that's always like a question for students in this program because of these different perspectives that are being offered. And I just have this quote from Steiner from a short essay called "On the Relationship Between Theosophy and Astrology" that kind of gets at this question in a really interesting way. And I can read it, but I just want to make sure that there's stop for a second and see if you have any thoughts or questions.
I've got plenty. We could go.
Okay.
We could go in many directions.
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that really interested me just then was you mentioned that he used an election for the Goetheanum. Do you know if he found that election himself? So he was trained enough in astrology to pick out elections, or did he kind of use an astrologer to do that? Do you have any more on that?
Well, I think he chose this one himself. He wanted to lay the foundation stone when Mercury was in Libra, and it was in tropical Libra.
Interesting.
So yeah, so I'm pretty sure that was him, but he did one of his main collaborators was a woman named Elizabeth Vrida, and she was the head of the astronomy section, and she also there was he gave of course he gave many thousands of lectures throughout his career, and one of the collections of lectures is called On Curative Education, and they were talking about the condition of some albino children, and he had Elizabeth Vrida draw up charts for them and they were sidereal. They were in sidereal astrology because he wanted to understand the combination of the cosmic influences at the time of their birth and the soils that they were born on, as and also their heredity as like contributing factors to their albino condition. So that's another example of him using it.
Right. That's really interesting that he was going particularly for Mercury in Libra as well for the Goetheanum. Maybe he was going for a sort of place of peaceful and diplomatic or well-reasoned and balanced discussion and thinking or something of that kind. Who knows? But yeah, that's super interesting. And also they used both zodiacs because it's something that has struck me and haunted me a little bit about astrology is that I'm completely confident that both tropical and sidereal astrology work. And, I see a sidereal Vedic astrologer myself quite regularly. And yet I also am confident in tropical astrology as well. And it kind of gnaws at me that I don't understand the sort of deep metaphysical reason why they both work and how they are different and how what precisely they are speaking to. Because for me, I feel like it's quite conceivable that they speak to different maybe levels of reality, or one of them's oriented to the stars, but the other is oriented more to the earth. If you had a deep enough understanding of these things and you maybe had the kind of clairvoyant perception that Steiner did, you might have a very clear idea of what the different zodiacs spoke to. So it's kind of interesting and perhaps not surprising that he used both of them.
Yeah, and I think there have been some anthroposophists who tried to draw out maybe what's implied by the different uses. And, kind of, I think what I've encountered along the lines of what you described, he conceives of, important to mention, the celestial bodies, stars, planets as the sort of like corporeal or sense perceptible expression of like ecologies of divine beings. And so I guess, when we're dealing with sidereal astrology, that's maybe what's especially what we're especially, I guess, focused on is there's sort of like influence of those beings. I don't know. And then maybe with the light cycle and the earth, like things that are closer to our experience while incarnated on earth. Because he also gave a lot of emphasis to the death chart as like giving information about like the whole sort of morphology of incarnations of a given individual. Really interesting. And one of the things that he emphasizes in this essay on theosophy and astrology is that one, he says there's a lot of wisdom that's been passed down in the tradition, and that there's more wisdom in the tradition that many people just don't even comprehend, in comparison to the accumulation of information of science. He's like, there's just like so much wisdom there. But he says also that it's necessary to develop this like higher capacity of intuition to like really do astrology. So maybe that's a factor as well, and informs how one would then understand the connection, or I guess the relevant or the appropriate context for sidereal versus tropical. Yeah, but I can relate. Those questions have vexed me as well, and were partially why I was ambivalent about, practicing professionally. But I think when you kind of like trust the intuitive element, then it makes it, and just from experience of like the resonance of a good reading with life, that's its own kind of proof. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, which you already actually touched on, is this whole idea of 7-year phases of life. I know that Steiner had some model of the lifespan, which divided it into 7-year phases, which is pretty interesting astrologically, for probably for multiple reasons, right? We can think of the phases of the Saturn cycle. We have the start of the cycle. We have the square, the opposition, and then Saturn return. Roughly speaking, divided into 7-year periods, and then we have Uranus's 7 years in each sign as well, which also gives us a kind of reason to think that 7-year periods of life could be a thing. Do you know much more about Steiner's 7-year periods? Is this something he developed intuitively, or do you know where he got it from, and if he ever brought any astrology into that?
Well, this is something I personally don't know enough about. I did read a book, a really great book by an astrologer, actually, a philosopher, and somebody who's also involved in anthroposophy to some extent. She's given talks for, I mentioned Andrew Linnell, the anthroposophist, who's really into kind of Steiner's vision of the future, technological future. She's given talks for his organization called Mistech. Her name is Monique Pommier, and she wrote this great book called Harmony, the Heartbeat of Creation, about like sacred geometry and the evolution of consciousness. And it just seems that, Steiner recognized that the number 7, has this sort of deep significance for the cosmos. He refers to Saturn as the cosmic timekeeper.
Well, it's one thing that I sometimes wonder about Steiner is, how much of this stuff did he perceive himself with his own explorations and sight, and how much he got from his own connections. And perhaps I've heard it said that he was a Rosicrucian initiate himself. So you'd think that potentially some of this stuff might have been given to him as part of his Rosicrucian training.
Yes, definitely. And, he's very consistently acknowledges his philosophical forebears, like the German idealists and Goethe and Schiller and all these other philosophers. But yeah, he doesn't talk. I mean, he does talk about esoteric, brotherhoods and things like that. And he talks about Rosicrucianism. But yeah, that's one of my professor's complaints is that he also had a huge library, and maybe it wasn't the case for his followers when he was alive, but at least for people today, it can be a little misleading to not have sort of like intellectual references or the acknowledgement of borrowings. He would also say things like, I'm not just repeating what other people have said. I've like confirmed all of this for myself through my own research. So if it sounds like a repetition, that's just because they got it right, basically. So whether or not that's the case, I don't know, but yeah. Yeah.
You wanted to move on to showing us something before I jumped in with some questions. What was it?
Oh yeah. Well, it's just a quote from this essay called "On the Relationship Between Theosophy and Astrology," and it's just really interesting. I feel like it's just kind of like a seed for now, but trying to like understand this question that I mentioned earlier, like what is the relationship between evolutionary cosmology and astrology? Because astrology arose more or less, in a interpreted according to a worldview that didn't yet know that the solar system had like formed, and gone through this process of development, rather than just being eternally there. At least that's how I understand it. And so is this Steiner here describing his research? So, through this whole process of training and meditation that he outlines for others, he says he sort of like fumbled his way through, I guess. He reads what he calls, and other theosophists, esotericists refer to this as well, the Akashic record or the Akashic chronicle, or you could say like the invisible cosmic memory of the world. And this is where he's like, he's discovering the past events of the cosmos, because again, the cosmos is like, for him, the visible cosmos is just the manifestation of celestial beings in this sort of like ongoing process of creation. And so he says, so he's like, so for him, reading the inner events of cosmic evolution is like reading the history of these interactions between these beings. Anyway, so this is what he says. He says, one need only look at the relationship between humans, the sun, and the moon as determined by the results of the Akashic Chronicle. From this, it will be seen that there was a primeval development of man in which his dwelling place was a celestial body that still consisted of the sun, moon, and earth together. So there's this picture of like a primordial unity that gradually differentiates and separates. And so astrology reflects this. And he says, therefore, even today, man still has powers in his being that are related to those of the celestial bodies mentioned. These relationships also explain the connection that still exists today between the effects of the celestial bodies mentioned and what goes on in human beings. However, these effects are very different from those of a purely material nature, which is all that modern science talks about. So it's just a really interesting perspective. I don't know, I don't know if it's true, and it somewhat conflicts with the interpretations of astrology that are kind of popular today, which want to make this really hard distinction between natural science and divination. But we have to remember that in the past, there wasn't that distinction. So, yeah, that was just something I thought might be interesting to bring.
Yeah. What I find really interesting about this perspective is the idea that we had been in contact with the gods easily, let's say, and that
Yeah.
over time we started to lose that contact, and that drove us towards trying to find other ways of connecting with them. And so astrology kind of arose or arose almost from the silence of the gods. So they stopped talking to us, and we start looking to, or trying to understand the mechanics of what we see in the sky, in a bid to kind of rekindle that connection somehow. So there's a sort of process of growing silence, but then that also has this side effect of leading us to actually understand the natural world a lot better, ultimately leading to the development of modern science, and interestingly enough, ending up with astrology almost completely in the doghouse as it is now. But I think it's an interesting picture, that kind of picture of how we got where we are today. I wondered if we could maybe shift a little bit now and just talk a little bit about the current time, the early 21st century, because I think Steiner had some interesting things to say about this particular time and about some of the things that we'd be dealing with in the world at the moment. And yeah, I wonder if you could speak to that. What did Steiner say about this period of history?
One thing I didn't mention is that his whole worldview is thematized or animated by the notion of polarity, this like creative dynamism of polarity, where it is like the yin yang, but it's like this creative process where one thing is changing into another. And every phase of cosmic evolution includes this sort of like upbuilding process where something is being born and coming into being, and then a phase of the process where it starts to decay and fall apart and die. And for him, especially like in our earth condition of like solidity and material incarnation, like what we think of as death is actually like a kind of reentrance into a higher life. And so that's one way to think about what I'm about to say, which is, according to Steiner, during this like larger cosmic period called the Earth epoch, we're in the decline phase. So he says the Earth is in this process of dying and falling apart. And that one expression of this is the increasing intellectualization of the world. and a kind of like scleroticizing of the world, like a hardening of it. And he sees this as borne out by the increase in mechanical technologies. And in this like larger cosmic vision, the poles are identified by him with these two kind of he calls them adversaries, these figures who represent different faces of evil, Lucifer and Ahriman. And Ahriman is the kind of more like Satan, like devil-like figure associated with the process of death and decay and becoming sclerotic. And so he says that these beings actually like incarnate in the course of Earth history, and Lucifer has already incarnated before the coming of Christ, and Christ is kind of like the midpoint of the whole thing. And then Ahriman is said to be soon to incarnate upon the earth and to sort of facilitate this process of mechanization and the gradual merging of human beings with machines to maintain ourselves on the earth long enough to bring it forward to the sort of point of evolution that it needs to reach. Um, so that's sort of like the picture he gives. He says that there will be this ongoing dilemma of merging with machines and like how we negotiate that, and like this gradual increasing externalization of our intellect in the form of machines. And that Ahriman is this dark force that he says must incarnate. It's like the necessity of, I guess you could say, the death process in the whole life cycle of an organism. And I found this initially, not not a very exciting depiction of the future. But it also, I felt like, made current events more intelligible, just this attitude, we hear from AI developers where it just seems like there's something happening that they're facilitating, but they can't just stop it. They don't want to stop it. It's like a force of its own. And so many people have associated, the coming potential emergence of artificial general intelligence with the incoming incarnation of Ahriman. And so there's like, one way you could think of it as like this, as you noted, Dan, like there's like this kind of polarity in the waxing or the rising of self-consciousness and the gradual dimming of the world as a revelation of the gods into the opacity of just the material world. And now there's like even it's like intensifying with the this sort of, I guess, onslaught of technology and the possibility of losing our potential as free spirits to creatively participate in the unfolding of cosmic evolution and make ourselves diaphanous once more to a spiritual world. So it's like intensifying this and sort of making it necessary today that we take on spiritual exercises for our own mental health.
Yeah, I've talked about that a little bit on the channel before. The Incarnation of Ahriman and what Steiner said about it is definitely some of his work that really caught my imagination a little bit. It was some of his lectures on the Incarnation of Ahriman and Lucifer. The things I read that made me think that he really did have an ability to see things which he perhaps shouldn't have been able to see by normal methods. And a lot of what he describes in his lectures about Ahriman are what we're experiencing now. The sort of ever deepening surrender to technology and technocracy and abstract systems and data. And these are the kind of things I think a lot of people are picking up on now as having been taken to the extreme. You hear people talking more and more about everything needing to be kind of data driven. What's important is the data, not so much the human experience of things. And there's ever growing drive to make everything more efficient. It's all about efficiency and seeing if we can create digital models of the world, and which almost seem to be seen as more important than the world itself these days. I wonder what your thoughts are on the actual incarnation of Ahriman, because if you read Steiner, he does say that Ahriman will incarnate as a human being,
Mhm.
and yet some people have suggested, well, was he really speaking about the systems that we're putting in place? Because I think it's a lot easier for us today to imagine that he was kind of seeing the growth of information technology and, as you mentioned, AI as this kind of personification in the form of Ahriman. But he, from what I understand, would literally said it would be a person. I'd be interested to know what you think personally about this, and what do people in Anthroposophy tend to think? Will Ahriman incarnate uh, as an actual human being, or is it enough to say that Steiner caught on to the development of the IT systems that we see today?
Yeah, well, so, in the world of anthroposophy, there are a lot of different opinions. So, I've heard people be like, "Oh, it's Elon Musk. Oh, it's Beard Thiel. Oh, it's, like." But then there's an anthroposophist named Andrew Linnell who has really kind of dedicated himself to excerpting and collecting as much of Steiner's statements about the future and the sort of like transhumanist trajectory and the incarnation of Ahriman, all these things, as he can. And he has like a timeline that he's developed for this. And he thinks that the actual incarnation of Ahriman won't come for like, I think another 100 years or something like that. And I kind of personally like, if it is to happen, if it is a thing, um, uh, I feel like it hasn't happened yet, if it is to be an actual human. Um, so, but I sort of remain agnostic about it. But yeah, I guess my sense is that it hasn't happened yet, if it is to happen.
Yeah. Well, one interesting thing about the way Steiner talks about Ahriman is, as you say, that it kind of has to happen, that it's almost like an initiation or something that we have to pass through. And so, in Steiner's conception, does he see Ahriman and Lucifer as ultimately doing God's work somehow, even though they are, they have their own agendas, which they will try to take as far as possible, and which will, can lead human beings to ruin? Are they sort of there necessary, like as the adversary, and that the act of fighting the adversary is necessary for our growth and becoming?
Yeah, I feel like this is, one of those very, the questions. One of my professors in my philosophy program would say, always pay attention to when a philosopher plays the mystery card, because that will tell you a lot about them. And I think, just the question of evil, is where mystery comes in. But if you read occult science, you see, like, in the whole depiction of these phases of cosmic evolution, when there is a kind of intervention on behalf of one of the adversaries, the higher beings always like come in and kind of like transmute it and turn it into something else. So there's this sense that one of these ancient words I use in my dissertation to kind of characterize Steiner's whole vision of cosmic evolution is apokatastasis, which basically means that everything comes from and then returns to God. And that's kind of like the whole process. So yeah, he even says, like, I feel like I remember Linnell repeating this, or maybe I just read it, that with whoever Ahriman incarnates as will be received very well, and will be perceived as someone who's doing like good things for the world, and will have a kind of like, I don't know if charm is the right word, but a positive reception, and that what he's bringing is necessary, and that anthroposophists, because that was his audience, need to be able to like recognize him when he arrives, and know how to skillfully participate and negotiate with what he brings. And so So yes, to answer your question, yes, from how what I understand of Steiner, there is this sense that um, evil is somehow necessary. I think there's one way he characterizes it some place where it's like an influence that is either too soon or too late. And but yeah, it's part of the cosmic drama and does seem to be always transmuted towards the good.
Well, let's hope that's true. That sounds good to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's hope it's true. Yeah.
Saying that, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. It's been a super interesting conversation. You are practicing astrology yourself. Perhaps you could tell the audience what you do and how people can find you if they want to contact you or maybe get a reading and learn more about what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Well, yeah, I have just in recent months decided to launch a practice after, working with astrology for 16 years. And what I'm offering now is like a combination of archetypal astrology, what I've learned from studying with Rick Tarnas, and also incorporating Hellenistic astrology as I've been learning it from Adam Ellenboss's school and others. So yeah, that's what I'm offering, just like, natal chart, transits, and other timing techniques, and also supplemented by tarot card pulls. And you can find me at microcosm.com, and that's with a K, so MICR0, not an O, K0SM. It's not the easiest thing to type in the URL box, but yeah, that's also my handle on social media and stuff. So
Okay, well, I'll make sure to put that in the description below in case people forget about the zeros.
the zero.
But just like to thank you, Ashton. It's been super interesting. I've learned a lot myself just listening to you as well, and it's been great. So thanks so much for joining us this time.
Likewise, Dan. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much to Ashton for joining me for this episode. Find his contact details below. Our interview continues in the members-only version of this video, which includes another 30 minutes in which we dive into Steiner's vision of the history of humanity and consider how it fits with other frameworks like the yugas of Sri Yukteswar and the astrological ages. If you enjoyed this video and you want to know more about Steiner's ideas about Ahriman, you might want to check out this video, which I put out a couple of years ago on this very subject. Thanks for watching, and see you again on the channel very soon.